Morning all. I'm just going to give it about 30 more seconds just in case others are in the lobby waiting to join. But while I'm doing that, just a bit of housekeeping. So brief introduction to myself. So my name's Adam Butler. I'm the Principal Cyber Solution Architect at ARO. Been in IT and cyber now for around 20 years. Worked in the defence sector at BAE Systems, worked with sort of large organisations down to the very small. And something I'm quite passionate about is the kind of threat landscape, what's going on, what we're seeing from it, and then kind of like how do you kind of take all that information and build kind of things around that to kind of close those gaps. So on left-hand side, hesitation is a vulnerability. So that was written by Dr. Richard Horn. So he's the chief executive of the NCSC. And those four words, if you like, are kind of, from the sort of head of the UK Cyber Authority. And what I'm going to do is spend sort of the next sort of 45 minutes to an hour talking about, why you wrote that and what it effectively means for a business like yours. So very quick on this slide, who is ARO for those that haven't come across us. So we are basically a business built up of around 8,000 customers from the kind of very small up to the very large. We deliver technology, cloud, IT, data center, collaboration, and obviously cyber services, which is my bag. So I guess what I can say from that is we're not a vendor. We're not there to kind of prescribe you, what we see as right. It is ultimately we're there to guide you and deliver on outcomes. And obviously you can see from the screen there, we've got platinum and or gold accreditations with some world-class vendors. Lastly, what is this session about and what it isn't? So look, it's not a product pitch. There's a mix of organizations that are in the room today, from sort of like the smaller IT teams where you're probably a little bit more lean, or up to the kind of mid-market and above, where you've kind of got a growing or complete security function. Everything I'm going to talk about today, these threats, they don't discriminate by the size. And, if you talk about the regulatory sort of consequences that I'll mention later, neither does that. Size doesn't matter in this space. But what I want to do is leave you with effectively three things: a clear picture on what's sort of changed in the last 12 months aligned to what's happening in the UK, an honest answer on whether or not your organization's ready for it, and then lastly, at least one action you can either take in tomorrow morning or at least after the weekend. So 204. So 2025, the NCSC responded to 204 nationally significant cyber attacks. To put that into sort of context, right, if we look at the previous year, the number was 89. So we're looking at about a 2.3% jump. So that's 4 nationally cyber significant attacks every single week. And the thing you've got to think about here is that these are the attacks that they're classified as nationally significant. So there are thousands upon thousands of attacks that either never get reported or they're never deemed as significant. So if you think about individual businesses, SMEs, supply chains, those are the kind of things that I'm here to talk about today. So let's have a look at what's changed. So let's start what's happened, like I mentioned, in the last 12 months. And I kind of want to ground everything in sort of real UK incidents with real consequences, not looking at everything that's happening across the globe. So you'll probably notice one company that I haven't mentioned on here because you've probably heard it from every single person that you've ever gotten a call with that talked about cyber in the last year. But let's look at the pattern, right? So you've got Co-op. So a threat actor called Dragon Force, or a ransomware as a service group, which I'll talk about later. 6.5 million records compromised via the ransomware. It was a supply chain entry point, and the data for the entire membership base was taken from that. Companies House, this was in March 2026, so it's a lot more recent. So if you have a look, into this one, it was a web filing flaw, exposed some personal data. So you've got things like home addresses, date of births, and this was across 5 million registered companies. And again, this has been active since October 2025. So it took about 5 months to kind of notice that had gone on. DXS International, so they are a software supplier into the NHS. They were hit by ransomware. Obviously, it's operated by the Health and Social Care Network. corporates and potentially patient-linked data was stolen from this. So if you think about personal information, probably the worst type was stolen in this. LastPass, I don't know if anyone in the room uses LastPass as your tool of choice, but they've been in this place many, many times now. I think probably 3 times where they've had some sort of security flaw. In this incident, 1.6 million UK users were affected. Backup data was compromised, and they were fined. And the thing to look at into this is they weren't fined for anything kind of like untoward, like the hardest thing to do. It was failures in endpoint security and access controls, right? So this is a really simple stuff for someone that is a password manager that's meant to kind of look after your data. And then lastly, Polaris APCS. So this was a third-party breach via a supplier of theirs called Intradef. So DBS checks data, national insurance numbers, passport, driving license. So again, just like the NHS, right, really, really sensitive data was taken in this. So if you kind of look at the pattern of what, I mean, these are big businesses here, right? But let's look at the pattern. What are the things that they have in common? Well, household names are not immune to this, right? So M&S, which I didn't mention, Co-op, LastPass, size and brand and recognition, that's not a defense, right? It's just a question of, if not when, how, and how prepared are you for when something happens. Supply chain, that's the attack surface that ultimately nobody owns, right? We talked in the past, right? And I've been doing this for a long time now, where we talk about the analogy of a castle and building walls, and that was kind of the perimeter, and you come into the perimeter, and the perimeter just kind of dissolved, and we've got identity, we've got third parties. But if you're a supplier, you've got a software provider, you've got something connected into that system, you don't own that perimeter anymore, and that's the problem that we're finding. Basic controls are still failing. So obviously, as I mentioned with LastPass, it was nothing, that grand. It was endpoint security, it was access controls, it was device security. Nothing sophisticated in this attack. Fundamentals and the regulatory well, the ICO noticed on that, and that's where the fine came from. And then the sector's not going to protect you, right? So there is some honor amongst thieves. So depending on the threat groups that you kind of read into, some won't maybe go and attack certain entities such as like the NHS or education. But it's not to say that others won't. So finance, legal, healthcare, manufacturing, public sector, retail, attackers are pretty much agnostic now. So the question is not about whether you are a target, rather, it's whether your response capability matches your exposure. Now, I can't see hands, but if I could, I'd be interested to see how many have put your hand up if I said, which of your suppliers have access to your systems right now, and do you know the exact number of that, and then what their risk exposure is? I probably would think it would be a small number, so it's just something to reflect on. So AI and phishing, want to sort of double click on this and look at this. Now, this is something that I kind of wish that I could stop speaking about, if I'm honest with you, that phishing is still kind of the primary vector, but the kind of takeaway from this is that the quality flaw has risen permanently on this. So let's just look about this in kind of a little bit more detail. So if you think about sort of 15 years ago, phishing was detectable because it was instincts. You had poor grammar, misspelled words, generic greetings, dear customer, suspicious domains, formatting links. I used to call it Yodified, right? Things were written in the wrong sort of order, and it was quite clear that it was a phishing. If it wasn't that, it was a payload, so malspam, Emotet, those kind of things, right? Things that would come in and then would be detected by virus signature detection. Now, all of that effectively created a quality flaw. So below the flaw, you had phishing that looked wrong. So if you trained your users, not every single one of them, right, but users could easily spot it. AI has completely removed that quality flaw now. So what you are looking at now is flawless, culturally nuanced, personalized with your actual name, role, colleagues, anything that is kind of out there, if you like, in the public space is access for them to then utilize in an email to yourself. So the detection instinct that you had sort of 15 years ago is completely obsolete. And I'm not saying that, it's not hyperbole, that's just the reality of kind of what attackers have. Now they have access to large language models. And I typically have an analogy for anyone that knows me for just about anything. And the best one that I have for this is if you kind of think about, counterfeit money. So if you look at the old counterfeit money. So you had the factory. So mass production of counterfeits, high volume, low quality. You could spot the fakes, ink bled, serial numbers didn't match. Your eyes were effectively trained to spot them, and it worked. And if you think about it now, so with AI-enabled phishing attacks, it's more like a forgery, right? So you get a perfect copy, indistinguishable from the real thing. It knows your language, it knows your organization. The difference is now that the forger can produce it at the same scale that the factory could. And that's the key point here, right? You can't train away past this. That's not a strategy. And while training is effectively still a key requirement, it is not the thing that is going to stop this from happening, right? There's AI on one side. You need to fight AI with AI on the other side. And just to kind of go into that a little bit further. So, if you think about what it actually does, so it doesn't guess. If you get an LLM, and again, just think about your own organization here, you probably have, or hopefully you have, an AI policy, and that policy will probably say what you can use it for, what specific tools. Is it ChatGPT? Is it Claude? Is it Gemini? Is it one of the others? And effectively, go on what you can put into that. If you're a threat actor, you don't have to worry about any of that. You can use all of them, any of them. You don't have to worry about what you put into it, and it's got access to the public information. So if it's there in the public web, it can go and use that. So your LinkedIn profiles, press releases, company websites, event listings, just about everything it's got access to. So from that, it's going to know your structure. So, reference your real colleagues, by role, it's going to scrape all this from LinkedIn. Knows your context. If you're writing things about projects, if you're writing things about recent news, whether that's by the business or personally via your own information, it's going to understand all that again, so things don't become generic. Language, we talk a lot, especially when I produce some of these collateral and marketing. Have a look at it. There's a tone, there is a language that we have as a business, and we need to kind of match that. They can match that, so they can make sure that the emails that come in. And look, the scale's without limit. So they can generate thousands of personalized emails in minutes. And just want to just kind of talk into that a little bit further. How do they do that? Because it still requires effort, right, to go and kind of do all these. And you can reduce skills for those that haven't used AI tools. You can kind of, create things and artifacts in the background that allow you to prompt it and get all the information you need quickly. But phishing has now become a service, just like you would, subscribe to, 365, any other software as a service type thing. Phishing is now as a service. So if you're wondering how like a criminal with absolutely no technical capability can launch such a sophisticated attack that's culturally nuanced and all the AI stuff I'm just talking about, that's where the franchise comes in. So the barrier to entry is completely vanished, and some really good sites on there, by the way, if you ever get bored and want to kind of go and look into it. But for about £200 a month, you can subscribe to an all-in-one kit. So you've got AI-generated lures, hosting, data execution. You don't need any coding whatsoever. They will do all the groundwork for you. They have SLAs. They have support. They have gold, silver, bronze. So if anyone here is part of a managed service provider, you kind of imagine that, but imagine that as a service, right? Now, most of the things that I typically talk about in this space is that the people attacking us are not really on our soil, but actually, when you look at the UK connection, there was a 2024 takedown of LabHost by the Met Police, and what they found from doing that and looking for, forensics of that is that the UK based criminals were actually using these kits to target UK citizens as well. So we were literally targeting ourselves. It's not always the case that it's someone from, one of the big three. And then MFA is no longer a guarantee. So, I'm not going to tell anyone here not to go and have MFA, right? And in fact, I'll come to that a little bit later on. But modern phishing as a service kits, Typhoon 2FA, Mamba 2FA, if you're going to go and do some research, use what's called an adversary in the middle attack. And just to very briefly explain what that looks like, an email comes in, you click on that email, and you think you're going to 365. And what you actually do land on is 365, right? So you're actually getting to 365, but you're going via a proxy. So there's a man in the middle, as we refer to it, and hence the adversary in the middle. And what they do is, yes, they'll steal the username and password. Yes, they'll steal the MFA token, but they last, 30 seconds to 60 seconds before it rolls over.
The important thing that they steal from that is the session cookie. And that session cookie is a unique string, and all you need is a cookie editor. Go to 365. Doesn't matter if you're on the same machine in a different country, whatever, right? Unless you've got specific controls in place. You do a cookie editor, you paste that cookie in, and you're in. So MFA is being bypassed now. So again, these tools have the technology to do that within it. So again, you know, it's probably a paywall, so you might have to go to the gold tier. But ultimately, if you have a moral compass pointing south, as I like to say, and £200 in crypto, then you're kind of on your way to kind of doing phishing. And just have a look at some of the numbers, the reason why I'm talking about this. So this was done by BioCatch. So BioCatch is they did a report in 2026. They're a digital banking fraud trend company. And what they do is look at fraud against UK banks and their business customers ultimately. So what they saw from that was there was a 62% rise in social engineering attempts. If you think about everything I've talked about AI, you know, it's quite obvious of what's kind of driving that, right? LLMs are allowing you to kind of go and get that social information a lot easier than they previously did. 140% spike in phishing specifically targeting business payment workflows. And this is really, for me, the number that matters. They're not trying to install malware, as I talked about in the past. They're after money, invoices, supplier change requests, payroll instructions. You know, 140% increase in a year is telling you where the attention is going here. And then DSIT cyber breach survey for 2026 ranks AI-powered phishing as the #1 threat to UK businesses. And that is effectively the UK's official government assessment. So what it effectively means in practice, look, my concern really is that the average SMB, and I'm not saying everyone on the call, has no technical control that sits between convincing, a convincing email and an authorized payment. So your controls are ultimately the finance team's judgment. And as we just kind of discussed on this, that judgment is being tested in ways that we're not built for, right? And hence why I'm saying that, you know, just training of users is not everything that you need to do. Now, that's all cool. We've seen phishing many times now. But where are we heading with this? Well, it's not just email anymore. So voice cloning technology has, you know, matured to a point now where an attacker can, you know, effectively replicate a senior leader's voice from as little as 60 seconds of a public, you know, any audio that you've got that's available public. So that could be a podcast, it could be a company video, reference from a keynote. Me talking right now and this being recorded is exactly one of those things that could be used. So this is effectively the case that put the industry on notice, if you like. So around early 2024, Hong Kong finance employee receives a request for a large transfer. Look, this is unusual, so they ask for verification, and that in itself is a good step, right? Some people don't, you know, they fall foul to this and the money is gone, but they ask for a verification. So the video call was set up, and on the call you had the CFO, senior colleagues, and all of them the employee recognized. The call went absolutely fine, and they transferred £20 million, and that is gone. Every single person on the call, except the employee that set up the call, was a deep fake, and that was generated in real time. Now, that's an obviously massive, scary, you know, story there. But BioCatch's report that I just touched on, they had confirmed in that they've seen a significant uptick in voice and video cloning attacks going against UK businesses. So I guess the thing to take from this is if your organisation relies on, you know, verifying for a process, that's now a gap. And how do you plug that gap, right? And that's not something that I have the exact answer for right now, but the sort of things that people are starting to think about, and this is going to bleed into the home at some point or another, right? Is, you know, do you have a secret word? Do you have a code word? Do you have something where it becomes more than just that verification, right? I think people probably remember a long time ago when the Terminator films, when he rang up and then he asked him about the dog and he made a different name for the dog. This is exactly that, right? You know, you need another way to do that verification when they can use video and voice cloning. And just to kind of bring it off, I just want to say, training is important, right? You should absolutely be doing training of your users. It's going to help them understand things that are not just phishing. But what I am trying to say here is it's not your phishing defense strategy.
The volume is going to overwhelm human judgment. You know, it's all right if you get one or two, but we're talking about mass volumes here. The detection layer has to be moved closer, right? So the organizations winning this are the ones that have moved from sort of just training people and then moving the detection to that kind of delivery space. And as I kind of alluded earlier, you need to fight AI with AI. You know, you cannot be in a position where you're fighting AI that does stuff at scale very quickly versus humans. So again, having behavioral AI in your kind of security stack is really important. So to move on to vulnerabilities, now we in ARO align ourselves to the NIST framework. There are many others, CAF, you've got syscontrols, obviously you've got things like Cyber Essentials, which is probably a lot less mature than some of these, but just to kind of explain NIST to you, because I think this is an easy one to explain, we have 5 core functions of that. Identify, which is identify what you've got and the protection and risks that you've got around it. Protect, go and put protection around those things. Detection, understand that, you know, ultimately things will be bypassed, right? Whether that's a firewall or an email tool, right? So you need to be able to detect anomalous behavior once it gets past that. And we do that so that we can respond. The quicker you respond, the better, right? You know, the difference between hours and sort of days is going to be the difference between private and public kind of breach. And then recovery, when all else fails and you need to kind of take yourself back to a state beforehand, that's the kind of recovery step. Now, vulnerability sits primarily in what I call the identify function, that first function there. So it's what do you have in the organization, the assets, and then what are the vulnerabilities associated against them. So let's talk about how vulnerability management used to effectively work, whether or not you're doing this via some sort of tooling, you know, you've got a Tenable, a Nessus, or something that tells you vulnerabilities, or you're just doing that because the vendors are telling you there's a patch. You know, a CVE is ultimately disclosed, usually alongside a vendor patch. Your IT team takes that patch, you test it in a controlled environment potentially, you deploy it, and the cycle for that is, you know, weeks, potentially months, depending on kind of the organization and what you have within it. And the model was built really on one assumption, right? And that was that there was time, and attackers need to find the vulnerability themselves, build it, exploit it, and deploy it. And that can take weeks too. So both sides were effectively, if you like, measured in weeks, and you in the fence had a chance. Now, I want to recall a story. This was probably 5 years ago now, so this is before today's world. I worked in the SOC. I had multiple sort of defense sector or large enterprise customers at the time, and there was a Citrix NetScaler vulnerability found. This was disclosed on a Thursday or a Friday. We wrote a threat intelligence brief about it. Citrix gave you can go and do this configuration. But if you think about an organization that I was looking after at the time, where they might have had, you know, anywhere between 10 and 80,000 staff and devices and things like that, performing a change on a Friday before going into a window on something as critical as a NetScaler was not something that people wanted to do when there was no proof of concept at the time. So although there was a vulnerability, there was no proof of concept, people weren't exploiting it. By the weekend, I think it was either the Saturday or the Sunday, that all changed. Proof of concept was written and people were scanning. So it was the kind of foundation for what was going to come next started happening. So, you know, the people that I'd spoken to on the Friday saying, do you want to do this emergency change? No, we're not going to do that. We'll wait till Monday and we'll kind of do it through the usual process. They were doing it on the weekends. Now, if we look at today, what if that entire timeline that you're looking at on the screen collapsed into a single day? And what the NCSC found is that in around 25% of cases, that is exactly what is happening now. So under 24 hours. That's the case, you know, that's the current, you know, state, and like I said, 25%, and what's the future state? So if you think about it, automated AI powered scanners identify and exploit the flaw within hours of a patch being released. And what you need to kind of think about this is, if you think about that 30-day patch cycle, that's no longer a security control. It's basically a window of opportunity. So 30 days, you know, from an attacker who needs maybe less than a day, right? Because of where we are with the modern technology, that's a problem, right? So that's not a future state, that is now, and that's what they confirmed at the NCSC in their annual review 2025. This was the exact words, just so we can read it together. The most significant AI cyber development will likely come from AI-assisted vulnerability research and exploit development, enabling access to systems through the discovery and exploitation of flaws in underlying code or configuration. Now, that sounds mental and scary, that AI tools are finding and exposing and exploiting things that are happening with vulnerabilities. But at the time, it was almost like, this is what we think is going to happen. But as of, I think I wrote this about a month ago, we have a name for something like that now. And you've probably come across this, some people on the call, and that is Mythos. So just to explain a little bit about Mythos. So April 7th, 2026, Anthropic, who are one of the major US AI companies, they announced an AI model called Mythos. And they did something quite unusual. They decided that it was ultimately too dangerous to release for public. So in their own testing, what they found from Mythos is that it demonstrated cyber offensive capabilities. It could plan, it could execute, chain together multiple steps of an attack, and it did so without any human sort of direction. And what they concluded, that releasing this to every criminal in the world and having this sort of capability was, something that was normally reserved for state actors, was not a good place to be. So what they did instead was this sort of something called Project Glasswing. And if you basically, to look at this, was like a defensive coalition of major technology companies. So you had things like AWS, Microsoft, CrowdStrike, JP Morgan, other banks, other massive vendors. And what they did was they gave them Mythos to specifically go and find and fix vulnerabilities in their software before something like this gets into the public. And the response from this has been pretty serious, right? So again, this has made it into the BBC Newses of the world and things like that, right? It's not something that's only in the cyber news. Bank of England governor spoke about it publicly. Barclays CEO has said that the banks have been testing their systems against it. And then the Canadian finance minister discussed it at an IMF meeting in Washington. So, some people believe this is a bit of kind of, clever marketing for Anthropic, but, the other side of that is you've got to look at it like this, right? It's going to be a point where if you think about ChatGPT when you first use it, and you're like, this is incredible. This was 3 years ago, whatever, right? But you could find limitations. You couldn't get it to read that file. You couldn't get it to go and execute on that. You only had access to information that was 3 years old, so on and so forth. You look at it today, we've come a long way, right? And the one person that went and sort of verified that independently, or at least at the time of writing, was the UK's own AI Security Institute. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So the chart is called The Last Ones. So basically what The Last Ones is a benchmark. It's a 32-step simulation of a corporate network attack. So think about your own environment. The attacker starts at M1, and then they work their way all the way to M9, and you can see like different things in the middle of that. So you've got initial reconnaissance, lateral movement, browser credential theft. All these are what are called tactics and/or techniques under a framework called the Reminder attack model. And what they then did was they gave all the tools access to go and then try to get it all the way to M9. So some of those you'll know from there. So GPT-4 hardly made it off the line, right? You've got Claude Sonnet, which is Anthropic, who made Mythos, and ChatGPT, and many others in there. But Mythos was the only one that made it all the way to M9 at the time of writing. And it did so in 3 of the 10 attempts. Now, this wasn't free to do. This was to kind of go and do this. And again, if you know about AI, there is compute power, if you call it that, or tokens. And to be able to kind of go and get to that, they gave it £10,000 worth of tokens per run. So if you think about the 10 runs that they had, and that's effectively how they got to M9. So what they've kind of concluded in the end was that, this is a step up from previous models in a landscape where cyber performance was already sort of rapidly kind of going, improving because of AI. The warning was that none of the models showed any kind of diminishing returns at that token level. So they spent 10,000, but they could have spent more. So the more compute you spend, the more capability you get. And there's no sort of natural ceiling yet. And then some other
sort of things that it went and found. So they did some internal red team in Mythos, but what they found was OpenBSD, a TCP stack. They found a vulnerability that had left undetected for 27 years. So, you know, this has had auditors at it, this has had fuzzing attempts, this has had just about everything. And this tool went and found something that has been dormant there for 27 years. And then another one in FFmpeg H.264 codec, so a popular codec for encoding H.264 video. They found something in there that was 16 years old. And again, that's something that's been tested approximately 5 million times, and you know, it survived every single one of those tests. We're now at a point where this tool was able to kind of go and break into that. So I guess the insight you can take from that, and an analyst called Drew Breinig wrote something about this in April 2026, right? The way that we used to think about cybersecurity ultimately was a bit of a knowledge game. So, you know, whoever had the most, knew the most rather about attacks won. Whoever had the best researchers won. Whoever had the best threat intelligence won, right? It was all about that kind of knowledge game. The model is changing now, and it's where, you know, if you think about AI autonomously being able to find vulnerabilities, exploit them, you know, it ultimately becomes a compute spend game rather than, you know, who has the most information. So the attacker's equation, you know, if you look at the budget, 100 million tokens or £10,000 a run, no model showed diminishing returns on that. So if you remember, the more you spend, the higher they could have got within that model. The defender's problem, you know, you've got to harden your system, you need to spend more tokens. So it's literally who spends the most, defense or the offense. And the one thing that I can tell you about, you know, cybercrime is go and have a look at how much a ransomware group makes. They have a lot more money in defense a lot of the time. And then what comes after Mythos? So again, I talked about this. ChatGPT, the first time we used it, we thought it was incredible, but we look back now with a different lens and we can see the flaws and we can see the models it's come through, right? Mythos might be the frontier today, but it's not going to be the frontier tomorrow. So if we kind of take all that and boil it down, what am I trying to say? Ultimately, monthly patching is broken. You know, if exploitation is now taking under 24 hours, a monthly patch cycle is not a security control. It's basically a 30-day, you know, window of opportunity for an attacker who needs less than a day. So if you're on the left at the moment, you know, monthly patch cycles, IT reviewing tests before deploying, exceptions manually managed, internet facing treated exactly the same as internal, that's kind of behind the curve. What we need to do, automated patching, at least on anything that's externally facing, you know, because that's the thing that's going to get probed, that's the thing that they're going to look at, and that's the thing that in less than 24 hours might be the reason that they get into your environment. 24/7 continuous detection, not periodic review. You know, the attackers, I mentioned that we had some that were on British soil, but a lot of them aren't. So their 9 to 5 is usually when we're sleeping, right? So being able to kind of detect on that. Behavioral analysis, not signature matching. Mentioned this in the AI space, in email, mentioned this in this as well, right? You're looking for behaviors. You can't rely on signature-based detection. And lastly, MDR, some kind of thing, if you like, you know, response side of it, you detect something, being able to respond in minutes, not in days. So patching is a hygiene, is like what I say, but MDR is like an immune system. You still need both. Now, ransomware, couldn't go anywhere without talking about my favorite friend, ransomware. So, you know, let's talk about that. You know, I think, you know, I hoped by now that it would have gone away. And, you know, I talked about this last year, and you can track ransomware coming back all the way back to like 1993, right? And it was distributed by floppy disk. But here we are, 2026, and it's still a massive thing. So, look, the reason that we're in the state that we are is it's not a craft anymore. It's a franchise. So just like I talked about that phishing as a service kind of model, ransomware as a service is matured now to a point where deploying ransomware attacks requires absolutely no technical skill. It's just a criminal marketplace, right? So the developers build, maintain the tools, you know, so the people that actually have the ransomware, the payment systems, right? That's kind of the franchise. That's the stuff that, you know, as a service, if you like. Again, like the phishing as a service, they have SLAs, they have support desks. That's both for the victims and you as an operator.
They have the way that they effectively get paid is if something's successful using their ransomware and their software as a service, they take 20-30% of the cut. So the incentive for them is obviously to maintain that, because people are going to continue to use that to then go and launch those payloads. Reputation management. So Dragonforce built credibility through delivery. So we say there's no honor amongst thieves, but imagine that thieves had almost like an eBay, right? An A++ for how well you are at kind of dealing with that. If everyone is scoring you bad, paid, didn't give us the key, so on and so forth, no one's going to pay, right? Anyone that's going to go and negotiate that does a bit of due diligence is not going to pay. So being credible and being able to say this, if you pay, we'll release the key, is actually an important thing to them. And as I've kind of alluded, there's a low barrier to entry. You don't need code. You just need to understand the exploit, and you just need, a bit of an email address and ultimately some cryptocurrency. And obviously, there's a theme here, right? AI is changing that landscape as well. So if you kind of look at the leaked source code from ransomware groups such as Akira or Killing, everything now is finding its way into these AI sort of hybrid mutations and variants. Now, I talked a little bit about signature-based detection on the previous slide, but they're not a signature at that point, right? So, you can take a look. You can find a painting in a lost, abandoned place, and you can look at it. No one's ever seen it before, and someone can look and say, well, based on the style of that, that's Picasso, because there's a signature. There is a thing that What we're doing here is we're malforming that into something that no one would ever determine as a Picasso, even if it was something he did. It's something that's been kind of morphed from that. So traditional antivirus is not what you need anymore. So EDR tools that rely purely on signature detection, you're basically completely behind the curve. Where you need to have is something that's behavioral. So I guess the practical question for you is, does your endpoint protection, just as a start of a 10, does that have behavioral analysis, or is that just signature matching? Because if it's the latter, you've got a gap. And then, look, we've talked a bit about, how things get in, right? If you kind of do the end-to-end cycle, right? So how do they get into your environment? So, AI phishing attacks is kind of a big entry point. We've talked about the kind of stats behind that. You have vulnerabilities, and again, how that's kind of been an entry point into there. You then have that protection layer. So the detection layers, we talked a little bit about EDR, we talked a bit about MDR here, but like when all else fails, you probably have a backup, right? So when someone gets into your environment and when they go and do something, right, and like I say, everything's failed here, you need to rely on that. So what does your backup strategy look like? What do you have? So 3 core things you need to have. Immutable, not just backed up. So modern ransomware is targeting a backup, right? This is a business model for them, right? If you think about, everyone just kind of recovered backups, and then what they then did was what's called a double exploit method. So they took the data and they exfiltrated it out, and then they said, we'll release this data onto the internet if you don't pay us, because people were just recovering from backups. It doesn't mean that they don't target the backups as well, right? Because that's still, the more damage they can do, the more likely you are to pay. So make sure that your backup is immutable. Secondly, testing recovery, not just retention, right? So I've spoken to a lot of people, and a number that gets bandied around quite often is, how much data you have, how much have you backed up, how many weeks, months, dailies, those kind of things. But that's not what's the interest here, right? It's, if you've never restored on that backup, then it's more of a hope than a control. And then lastly, it kind of comes in that immutable piece, but being air gap from the threat. So cloud native, immutable, isolated. The recovery path, when you go and do that, it must be operationally separate from the environment that's being compromised. Otherwise, the attacker can effectively take both. So I guess to think about it, recovery capability is now like a business continuity requirement. It's not an IT concern. So the board needs to know that the stat that they should care about is the recovery time objective and what that actually is, and whether it's being tested as well. Okay, let's shift from the threats themselves and then what happens. I'm going to kind of concentrate on some of the bigger boys here just because we can kind of learn from them. But 3 recent fines, 3 clear signals. So Capita, to start with, £40 million fine, October 2025. They were fined for slow instant response and inadequate governance, and that was confirmed with the final penalty. Advanced, they were data processors, so they weren't, like a full part of the puzzle here, just a data processor, and they were directly liable for a security failure. And that was not just so what we're saying, it's not just data controllers, just the people processing things in the background can be fined. LastPass we touched upon earlier. It was a failure in employee endpoint security control, access controls, and device security. Now, none of these fines were for being attacked, right? The thing to think about here is they were all fined because the ICO looked under the bonnet. So the regulatory signal is the ICO is now penalizing systemic invisibility. So the failure to detect a breach in a timely manner, not just having the breach itself, is what's causing the problem. Now, the one thing that I really have to signal and you take away from this is that, failing to implement MFA on administrative access is now considered negligence. It's a breach of GDPR. It's not a missed security control. It's not an oversight. It's not a shortcoming. That's negligence. So what that effectively means in practice is if your organization experiences a significant incident and MFA wasn't in place on an admin account, you're going to get a fine. That is the long and short of it. It's a failure of GDPR and an almost certain outcome. So I guess the question that you have, if you just take a moment and think to yourself, is MFA in place on the admin accounts that you have right now? Domain admins, 365 admins, global admins, cloud root accounts, MSP access, all those things. And if you're not 100% certain that the answer is yes, then I guess the thing that I want you to do tomorrow morning, have a coffee and or a Yorkshire tea, because anything else is subpar, and then think, have I got this in place? And if the answer is I don't know, then please email your account manager at ARO and we'll be able to have a look into that and help you with that control. Now, I don't want to leave you feeling like compliance is completely impossible and that the ICO is just asking for perfection, right? There are 3 things that every organization here can deliver on, right? Evidence of reasonable controls, MFA that I just touched upon, patching, access management, endpoint protection. They're not asking for perfection here. It's just proportionate controls for the risk that you carry. I talk about this a lot with people, that there's kind of a balance between how much you spend on kind of protecting and detecting and all that good stuff versus what happens if you don't, right? And it's about that, trying to manage that balance. And that's the evidence of reasonable controls. Document decision making. When you identify or choose not to implement the control, right? Why is that, right? When you identify the gap, was there a remediation plan? Have you accepted the risk? Do you do risk management, right? Again, they're assessing governance and not just the technologies that you have. And then lastly, the incident response piece, right? So the Capita fine was about the slow response. So when a breach occurs, what you do in the sort of first 72 hours determines kind of your sort of regulatory exposure and what might happen after that. The ICO, if people aren't aware of this, you've got a duty to report a breach within 48 hours if it concerns personal information. My advice to you is whether you know that or not doesn't always come straight away. You might know someone has accessed the system, but you might not know the exact thing that they accessed. So my advice is to speak to the law enforcement. Hopefully you've got an MDR provider or some sort of SOC service that can kind of help you through that instant response. And if not, then please do speak to me about that. But ultimately, speak to the ICO earlier rather than later, just to notify them of the breach. And then while you're working through understanding the forensics and what's happened, then you can effectively kind of give them that information when it comes in. Act fast, don't act kind of slowly. Now, the 3 uncomfortable questions I said that I was going to ask. So again, I can't see the answers here, but something I want you to think about. If an attacker compromised a credential, an account, we talked about a little bit about the perimeter being user accounts, how long would it take before you would know? Is it hours? Is it days? Do you have the capability to even answer the question with confidence? Something definitely to think about. Question 2, when did you last test your incident response plan, or does one even exist? So a plan you've never rehearsed is just a document. The difference matters enormously under pressure. Having been through this multiple times with businesses, just to call on one thing, if you lost access to the system that allows you to communicate, be that email, 365, or whatever that looks like, how do you notify? How do you make sure you are telling people what's happening as a part of that response? So just communication streams and how you communicate is a massive important thing that some people overlook. And then lastly, which of your suppliers have access to your systems? And would you know if the credentials were misused tomorrow? So DXS, Polaris, Companies House. The entry point was rarely the target. It was not, the question, if you like, is whether or not not whether you have suppliers, it's whether or not they have the visibility into your environment. So looking ahead, we've said the gap is growing and it's not closing on its own. So, NCSC's own assessment is direct. Sophistication of state-sponsored, right? So we talk about nation states attacking people, right? That criminal tooling is outpacing the average UK business's ability to defend. Now, we used to say that the good stuff was kind of held just for the nation states. But what they're saying now is you start with the state tooling, that's getting picked up very quickly now by the criminal adoption, and then that's the thing that's landing in your inbox. So governments are defending against today's real, criminals of the world. 12 to 18 months from now, that's what you and I and everyone on this call will then be kind of, having to defend against. So the techniques, the capabilities are making its way into the kind of SMB space in 12 to 18 months. China is currently exceeding 30,000 unique attacking IP addresses per month target in the UK. So the tools, techniques, and playbooks from these will filter down. They always do. So we come back to where it all started. Hesitation is a vulnerability. And I guess what Dr. Richard Horn was trying to say on this is, if you take all this in and you do nothing, then that's the hesitation, right? It's not thinking, it's not taking it into account and kind of coming up with that measurable, what's the risk, what's the reward, what do I do about this, right? So 3 weeks ago, you read this on a slide, the next 90 days is what kind of decides whether or not it's a quote or whether or not it's the thing that impacts you. So want to kind of leave you with what good looks like. So 3 practical steps for any organization, regardless of your size or your budget. Firstly, I talked about NIST a little bit, about you've got to identify what you have and what the kind of risks are to be able to kind of formulate your detection, response, and recover. This is exactly that, right? So establish your baseline. So we built a cyber maturity assessment. It's NIST aligned. So the things that I've just talked about, all it is an hour of your time. It will effectively, we'll ask you questions. I'm not going to ask you to open a firewall, dig into that config. It's just, what controls do you have in place? And we can align that and tell you kind of what you're doing well, but where your gaps are, and then kind of like an honest picture and kind of where you should sort of take the next steps. Next one, move detection close to the threat. Review your current controls, mainly about that detection. So, you're dealing with it at point of delivery. You're not dealing with it retrospective, right? You're not using the kill chain analogy, wait until the person gets to taking the sort of the money out of the bank and you stop them at that point, right? Ideally, you stop them at the front door at least before they get to the vault. So your email security, your identity monitoring, and continuous vulnerability scanning are the priority layer that you kind of need to be looking at based on the sort of threats that we're seeing today. And then lastly, test your response. Document the response plan, test it, know who calls who. I mentioned that. What decisions get made under pressure, what your ICO notification obligations are that I mentioned. Do all of that. A tabletop exercise. You might not go down into the sort of nitty gritty of it, but you will find a lot by doing those kind of things. Now, promise you this wasn't going to be a sales pitch, but I would be, ill-advised not to kind of give you a little bit of information about how we can support you with this. So look, we're not a vendor, as I mentioned. We're a guide, whether you're an SMB, mid-market, our enterprise, you're our goal ultimately is to help you move from that sort of hesitation that we talked about to being proactive AI native defense. So we can do that through diagnostics, detection, the managed detection response that I talked about, defense, behavioral AI against kind of these attacks, recovery, immutable backups, testing of those, vulnerability management, and of course we've got the accreditations. The thing for me is I don't believe that one size fits all. So if you're an SMB with a sort of lean team or a mid-market firm or an enterprise, my job is just to act as your guide, right? So we're going to help you move from that hesitation to a proactive sort of AI defense. And if anything I've covered today resonates with you and you want a more detailed conversation about your specific environment, please do come and find me and drop me an email. Lastly, just to give you a look at what that complimentary cyber maturity assessment looks like, there is a QR code on there that you can scan that will get this booked. It's completely free. On average, it takes about an hour. As I mentioned there, you get an output from it that it looks like what you can see there on the screen. So you can kind of see where you're doing well, where you've got your criticals, where you need to improve, and then a strategic roadmap of kind of what you should do and the kind of priorities that you would do with it. Ultimately, the report is good because it gives you that information, but my job is to take that report and kind of build something around that that kind of works with you, your risk kind of profile, and kind of what the budgets look like for the year to ensure that you're kind of meeting on those obligations. Now, I've taken 51 minutes and talked a lot, but I am absolutely open to any questions that anyone might have, and I appreciate everyone's time for joining. Q&A, let's have a look. So the question is, in order to run the assessment, what kind of information would you need? Would I need to prep anything in advance for the meeting? Typically, no. As long as you know the environment, the majority of the questions people can answer. As I mentioned, I'm not going to ask you to go into your firewall, into your endpoint tool, and go and get me that very specific piece of information. It is very much, what do you have as an endpoint tool? What is, is it doing behavioral analysis, or is it just doing antivirus? Those kind of questions are the things that are going to come up. I've actually done this with people that don't come from a technology background, and they've been able to answer most of them. The benefit of this is that we can kind of save that as a snapshot in time. So if you don't know the answer to it and you need a bit of time, and you can come back to me, we can go and input that. Secondly, if we do it today and you maybe don't score so well, we implement some security controls to kind of bring you up. We can then redo that so you can see where you were and kind of where you look like now. So again, completely free, completely complimentary, and hopefully that answers your question. Any more questions? What does a cyber maturity assessment look like? Again, I'm just going to drop back one screen. A little bit like that is the output. I can show you a bigger one on a separate call and run through it with your organization, of course, but you get a PDF output of who you are at the top. The overall score, again, is based mostly on NIST, but it's got other different frameworks. MITRE ATT&CK, which is the attacker's lens, if you like, there, and it has some cyber essentials alignment. It tells you where you're going criticals, so like what you're not doing and it's critical, you need to go and do something straight away, where you've got improvements, and what you're doing that's good, right? And I'm not here just to tell you everything bad, right? Although it might feel like that way from the threat landscape. The threat landscape is ultimately talking about risk and risk exposure. My job is to try and help you kind of navigate those risks. But again, the output gives you all of that information, and then that roadmap in this is what good looks like, and this is kind of the things that you would need to go and put in to kind of meet that requirement. And I don't think there is any more questions. So again, just want to thank everybody for joining today. Hopefully it was useful. Please do reach out to me. Where are we? There we are. If you have any questions at all and want to kind of follow up with anything that you didn't want to put on the call. And again, appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody. Bye.